Hello, everyone. We've arrived at part 4, and our final destination for today is, of course, gospel music. For those of you who are not familiar with some of the long-standing performing institutions that are here in New York City, Lincoln Center is a major hub of the performing arts at this point. They have a specific jazz uh, performance venue that is located very close to Columbus Circle. And one of their major components to the Institute itself is to put an initiative out there for learning and public engagement. Um, so Jazz at Lincoln Center happens to have a really wonderful educational series. There's a 4-part video that is about the history of gospel. I want us to just watch the first part of it together, although you're definitely encouraged to watch the other 3 parts. They're about 10 minutes a piece and set alongside of some really illustrative musical examples. I'm going to stop this video at a number of different points to further elaborate on some of the ideas that are presented here by our speaker, and then ultimately lead over to my lecture notes to discuss the particular characteristics that are present in gospel music as a genre. So without further ado, let me go ahead and pull up our video.
Hi, my name is Eric Reed, and today I'm going to be talking about gospel music and its roots. To be clear, gospel is not a style per se, but the word itself refers to an accounting or a message. In church talk or in Christendom, we say the gospel of Jesus Christ is the good news that Jesus lives. That's what gospel music, that's where the term comes from. So when you have gospel music, it's music that is preached from the Bible, applied to singing, telling of biblical stories, biblical characters, talking about God, holiness, etc. So when the term gospel music was penned in about the late 1800s, it was a distinction from the hymn from the 1600s or the 1500s, the spiritual, which comes from African slaves brought to the United States, and gospel blues, which is a loose term that Reverend Thomas Dorsey versus Tommy Dorsey, the trombone player, Reverend Thomas Dorsey penned in about the 1920s or so. And I'm going to show you some examples, the differences between all of these different genres or styles.
Great. So before we do that, I'm going to go back over to my lecture notes and talk about Thomas Dorsey. And indeed, his dates are 1920. Let me pull up my lecture notes here. So 1920, he helped really meld secular traditions within gospel music, and it really translated into the major mass appeal of gospel music as a budding genre. And he also, as a musician and a composer, arranger himself, helped train some of the really prominent voices that rose out of this music tradition, which is, again, thinking about education being an important part of things. Love seeing that there's a figure here in history that is both a contributor in the field of knowledge in addition to the field of creation. So let me go ahead and pull our speaker back up.
Gospel music was supposed to be easier, more accessible to sing versus what was called the church hymn. So if we take a song like "A Mighty Fortress Is Our God" by Martin Luther from about 1528, I'll play an example of that. and then you'll hear the melody, you'll hear the beauty of it, it's a beautiful song, but you'll hear why maybe it's not quite so easy to sing or as accessible. Now, as you can hear, it's a beautiful melody, but not necessarily that easy to sing. Again, that's about 1528. So
Let's talk about really quickly why it's not easy to sing. Part of it is because the voices are being aligned with this idea of Western counterpoint. The idea that our bass voices are moving in fairly large intervals, our soprano voices, our upper voices are moving in smaller intervals. And the melody versus being shared more equally distributed amongst different voices is really only controlled by the top voice. And as a result, everything but the top voice is really difficult to sing. For any of you who have tried to sing in a hymn setting and you're not the soprano voice, it's significantly more difficult to sing anything but the melody. So what are we going to hear? A disruption of this kind of construction in order to accommodate the appeal for a larger, more community-based participation group.
the gospel song came along, or the term gospel music or gospel song, in about the late 1800s. Here's a song called "Must Jesus Bear the Cross Alone." Now, it was adapted from a Scottish song called Maitland. But this song, and a lot of times the music would come either before or after. Oftentimes these songs weren't co-composed. Sometimes there were songs or melodies that were based on poems that existed, like with Amazing Grace. John Newton is given credit for writing this poem, Amazing Grace, this accounting of the way he was feeling when he wrote the lyrics, when he wrote the words, and then the music was added sometime later. That happened quite a bit. This is a composition, Maitland, or "Must Jesus Bear the Cross Alone," which is based loosely on the hymn, but it's known as a gospel song. So that was about 1844 when that was published.
Before we move on from that, one of the things that makes that setting much easier to sing is, do you notice how close his hands were together? With everything more encompassing a smaller range rather than a wider range, we're inviting things that are more within the compass of the human voice, and therefore inviting greater participation in this particular genre and greater appeal. Do you notice that you end up liking songs that you yourself can sing somewhat okay, a little bit better than some things that are completely out of your range? We like that participation-based element quite a bit. So it's going to factor into some of the musical characteristics that we encounter in this genre in particular.
And it sounds similar to the hymn, played in the hymn style or four-part harmony, as it were, soprano, alto, tenor, and bass. But it's got a different, more singable melody. And the lyrics were easier to sing too. If you think about hymns that were written in the 1500s that come from Europe, Germans and French and things like that, and then the English translated, it was much harder to sing. It was like singing music in Shakespeare talk, as they, thee, and thou in those old English. So we've got "Must Jesus Bear the Cross Alone," that's gospel music. And then along comes Reverend Thomas Dorsey, who writes a composition called "Take My Hand, Precious Lord," in about 1930, 31, 32, somewhere in there. And it's very closely connected to "Must Jesus Bear the Cross Alone." In fact, it's almost the same song, but it's different words. And the term gospel blues is something that Thomas Dorsey used to describe his music, which was the hymn through the spiritual, through gospel music, but using the blues. Reverend Thomas Dorsey was born in Villa Rica, Georgia, and then eventually moved up to Chicago, which became known as the home of gospel music or the birth of gospel music. Mahalia Jackson, all these people up there, Louis Armstrong, Jelly Roll Morton, Bix Beiderbecke, they were all there in Chicago at the same time, if you can imagine that. So Thomas Dorsey comes up with this style. He was raised playing gospel music in the church, but he became known as a very popular and very successful blues musician before he became known as a gospel music composer or player and singer. So he combined the style of gospel music, something like Must Jesus Bear the Cross Alone, and the idea of the gospel blues. And again, we're talking about gospel being the good news. So his compositions became more preaching and charismatically oriented in their interpretation. And also, the melodies were not sung nearly as straight, because out of the African tradition, again, we get this whole idea of singing off the page or line or shape note singing, more improvisation. And what we call now today, we call it the melisma. When you hear all of these gospel singers or a lot of these R&B and popular singers, they sing the line and then they do all these little twists and turns and acrobatics and pyrotechnics around the note, when it's really just one note that's part of the melody. So this is Take My...
By the way, so melisma or melismatic phrasing is where you're specifically giving more than one pitch to a particular word or syllable of a word. So artists that often do this, like Mariah Carey or Whitney Houston, when we're talking about popular music, this idea that like that's a really terrible version of a melisma. And we hear that a lot of times actually in really early religious music, but also within the context of gospel music. And some of the traditions that spring forth from gospel as a larger genre term.
My hand, precious Lord. Now, if you go to any black church in the United States, you'll never ever hear it played like that, because the music doesn't come from off the page, it comes from out of here. Now, Thomas Dorsey was a proficient musician. He knew how to write and read music, so he also got very heavily involved in the business side by publishing his own songs. I'm sure you're familiar with the term Tin Pan Alley. Well, in Chicago, they didn't have Tin Pan Alley per se like they had in New York City for the Great American Songbook with Richard Rodgers and George Gershwin and things like that. But there were situations in areas of black Chicago where they would stand on the corner singing their songs, and that's how they promoted their music. And I believe at that time, Thomas Dorsey collaborated with Dr. Sally Martin, and they would sell lead sheets for about 10 cents or something like that, if you can imagine that. Now what I'm going to...
So before we leave that as a topic, I just want to preface something that we'll be doing later on, which is studying the development of jazz briefly. The history of jazz is often taught in its own course, so I'm not trying to give it justice by talking about it in one lecture, but thinking specifically about regions. In our final unit, talking about the North, we're going to make sure that we are drawing some attention and focus to Chicago and the jazz scene, part of which our speaker right now is elaborating that and sort of giving away that it is a area that's incredibly rich in terms of its musical offerings in the early part of the 1900s.
I'm going to play Take My Hand, Precious Lord, in the way that you would generally hear it, for the most part, in just any black church. You could just throw a rock and hit a black church where it would sound something like this. not nearly as straight, and somewhat rubato or out of time. So through that, you can hear all of the blues, the jazz, the spiritual style. You hear several triads or even some extended chords. You hear all of the influences of European music, of the African style, of westernized music, all of that involved in the sound of what Reverend Thomas Dorsey called the gospel blues. And it would be even more effective with a singer, if you can imagine that. The power of somebody like Mahalia Jackson or Bessie Griffin or any of those great gospel singers of the day.
So again, there is this is a multi-part documentary, not so much documentary, a educational moment for the history of gospel music. So if you're intrigued by some of that, I encourage you to watch the other 3 parts. But I want to pull up my lecture notes to make sure that we've got an understanding of what's happening with our particular style points. So gospel music, again, it's a genre of Christian music, and as we've already done through our initial 3 parts of lecture, is traced where it has come from, beginning in the 17th century. Now, contemporary gospel and even 20th century gospel have a number of different style points that have been manipulated and accented in a variety of ways over time. But our story, as we could tell, like really began in the 1920s, starting to pick up heat into the 1930s. Something that's always going to remain is this first part, the dominant vocal aspect of this genre. And there's usually a lot of detail when it comes to the harmony that is employed within a piece of music. And some of this harmony, which our speaker called extended, is very jazz influenced, using some notes that are considered dissonant to some extent and require a sense of resolution. In essence, a word that I use to describe some of the vocals that occur in gospel music are somewhat bittersweet. Other instruments and timbres outside of the human voice include the piano, the Hammond organ, tambourines, drums, bass guitar, and electric guitar or electric bass even. And these instruments, as you can tell, are more modern than some of the things that we have traced in other musical traditions. The Hammond organ makes an appearance in surf rock, as we have heard. Tambourines do as well, but tambourines were a part of the ring shout that we covered in the second part. Electric guitars and bass guitars and electric basses are going to be more commonly used in the rock genres, but as rock increases in popularity and running alongside of the development and advancement of gospel music, we're obviously going to have some intrusion of that genre onto other genres. The lyrics, by and far, are about, their songs of testimony, persuasion, tales of warning. Those are just some of our lyric points and subject matters that we cover. In terms of rhythm, while we do have a prevalence of simple meter, that is because we're going to incorporate some other rhythmic nuances in the construct of simple time. So we're going to have lots of what we call rubato, pushing and pulling of time, where time is irregular. The reason that we like rubato is it feels particularly human to us. It feels somewhat flawed. It's not regular. By comparison, music that we listen to that's very regularly paced are a number of tunes in the popular music genre, if not almost all of them at this point. If you hear it on the radio, it probably has a regular recurring pulse. Rubato kind of sounds very emotional to us. And because some of the lyric content of gospel is somewhat emotional in its reach, we're going to have the presence of rubato when it comes to rhythm. We also have echo, and echo is something that's going to be a carryover from our call and response tradition, but it's going to show up in our accompaniment. And we heard echo being used and reverberance being used in the surf music genre to create the illusion of the sound, or to give us the remembrance of waves or water. And in this case, it's going to have a different meaning to us. Before we conclude our fourth section, I want to pull up a couple of listening examples that really showcase the gospel genre.
The next song needs no introduction. The other day in rehearsal, Aretha began to sing it. And when she got to the part that says, through many dangers, and I looked over at her and saw the tears rolling out of her eyes. Because never did we think, I think 20 years ago, that God would do great things for us. Can I get a witness here tonight?
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that sings I see.
Well, that certainly makes me cry every single time I listen to it. Aretha Franklin, quite a gifted singer. The opening of it uses so much rubato, this feeling of pushing and pulling of time, which makes the singer feel like they are somewhat at odds with the music they are accompanying. In this case, by the piano, which is also being sort of pushed and pulled by its own sense of meter. We had lots of melisma as well, using it. If you're still confused about what melisma is, the opening of Amazing Grace starts out with a big old melisma. And it feels particularly emotional to us, especially at this slow tempo. I want to play something that's in contrast to this as a way of closing out our fourth section. So our speaker mentioned Louis Armstrong and of course jazz in Chicago, and this is the performance of When the Saints Go Marching In that is definitely calling into focus the gospel style that will from which Aretha Franklin's performance will emerge. So that's the later part of the genre. This is on the earlier side.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, here's one you all can sing with us. When the Saints Go Marching In. Folks, everybody sing. Now when the saints go marching in. Now when the saints go marching in. Yes, I want to be in that number. When the saints go marching in. Sing it again. Now when the saints marching in. Now when the saints go marching in. Yes, I want to be in that number. When the saints go marching in. Ah, y'all sing pretty out there. Joe Daringburg.
So I love this because this is, again, gospel that's rubbing elbows with a number of other genres that were popular at the time when gospel was sort of spreading its wings. And in this case, we have Dixieland style that Louis Armstrong was really commonly associated with, in addition to his sort of, there's plenty of kind of gospel elements that are here that we're hearing in this setting as well. The thing that's really ringing Dixieland is the instrumentation here, the clarinet and the trombone together. Those are actually things that we heard a lot of times in the folk music of the klezmer tradition. In this case, we also have a backup female vocalist. That's going to be a style point that's really a part of the gospel tradition, especially as a call and response element with the lead vocalist. So we have that heterophonic texture that's going back and forth. So as we, as we move into the 20th century in general, we're starting to encounter things that are less in one specific genre, and sometimes more a jumbling of many different genres together, making the musical experience just that much more diverse and rich. In any case, I hope you've learned something about gospel music, a little bit about the history of the United States and the prevalence of spirituals in the African American community, and what gospel has sort of turned into in the last, I don't know, 100 or so years. In any case, I will see you back for our next lecture tomorrow. We will be talking again more about the music traditions that occur in the South.